Professor Ali Kazimi, our guest. He has put together a documentary a few years ago called Continuous Journey, and he's continued the journey to a coffee table book called Undesirables, and it's the story of the Komagata Maru, an infamous time in our history, and the World War, the Great War was about to start. So did this get lost, or do you know what I mean? Like lots was going on.
A lot was going on, and larger and bigger things happened, and the war really removed this from public memory at the time, because a huge male population from Vancouver, which was a fairly young city at the time, left the city and joined the war effort. But also India at the time raised the largest volunteer force ever raised until that moment. 1 million Indian men, or South Asian men broadly, fought for the British Empire during the First World War.
In the colonial era.
In the colonial era, yeah.
But they couldn't live anywhere in the empire.
They couldn't live anywhere in the empire.
That's the point.
That's the point. You could fight for the empire, you could die for the empire, but going to certain parts of the empire was a bit of a challenge.
Simply, you could be cheap labor, but you're the wrong color, or what?
That's right. That's pretty much it. That's pretty much it.
And who on this side of the pond helped them? Edward Byrd, lawyer?
Edward Byrd, lawyer. Really, Edward Byrd for me is a real Canadian hero. You know, he stood for things that today we celebrate as Canadian values.
Yes, and this would be white Edward Byrd.
This is white.
I hate to keep bringing color up, but essentially it was about color.
It was about color, and I'm glad that you're doing so, because Edward Byrd was not just white, but he was Anglo-white, right? I mean, he was from the establishment, and that made him even more remarkable. And I had the pleasure of meeting Richard Byrd, Edward Byrd's son, and his grandson and his other grandson, John Byrd, who gave me the portrait of Edward Byrd that's in the book. And Richard Byrd said to me, you know, my grandfather was one of these lawyers that we call today, that these are the lawyers that fight the good fight. And it's an incredibly lonely way to live, because it really cuts you off from your own community. You're going against the grain. You are not very popular. And when Richard Byrd said, his grandmother, when he was 11 years old, asked him, what did he want to be when he grew up? And he said, I want to be a lawyer like Grandpa. And she held him by his shoulders and shook him and said, no, you will not.
Oh, too dangerous.
Well,
or too fraught with...
Too fraught, and I think she paid the price for that. You know, she paid the price for the family being isolated. And Edward Byrd was very fearless. He basically said, Canada is denying basic civil rights to fellow British subjects. This is unconstitutional.
And how many activists were on shore working to land these men and 5 women?
The Sikh temple, or the Gurdwara as it's known, which was on 2nd Avenue at the time, was the center of the community. And it was a really inclusive space that was not just a religious space for Sikhs, but for the entire South Asian community. So there was a group of 15 men that were deeply politically engaged in seeking equality for South Asians in Canada, and who saw this as an opportunity to actually make sure that the continuous journey regulation is taken off the books. It's challenged successfully in court. And they raised money not just for the provisions of the ship, but also for Edward Byrd to fight the case.
And so they paid for the legal advice.
They paid for the legal advice.
The legal fight.
That's right.
But it would seem to me that at that time they were discriminated against too.
Oh, absolutely.
Within the country.
Absolutely.
Couldn't work at certain jobs.
That's right.
Most of them delivered fuel, things like that.
Right. And because South Asians in 1907, and most Canadians, and in fact most South Asians don't know this as well, were stripped of their right to vote. One of the things that happened as British subjects was, if you moved to different parts of the empire, within a year of residence, you had the right to vote. You had the vote. And what happened in British Columbia specifically is that they were taken off the municipal rolls. And what the federal government said was, well, since our voter list is based on municipal rolls, you simply don't exist on the rolls.
Right.
So you can't vote. Now, not having the right to vote meant that you could not join certain professions. You could not even aspire to be a lawyer or a doctor or any of those. So you were restricted to fairly low-paying jobs. Some people did make a lot of money by becoming real estate agents. So real estate became a big thing in terms of trying to move up the economic ladder.
And what kind of social life did they have?
Wonderful question, thank you. We don't know much about the men. We know that they lived largely like the Chinese in bachelor societies. There were very few women. There were less than half a dozen women in the community at the time, which was about 2,500 strong. We know that many of them did have relationships with white women that did make the papers when one or two of them did marry white women. There's a photograph in the book that's one of my favorite photographs of two Sikh men dressed in traditional loincloths wrestling. And it's a wonderfully staged image because behind them is a group of men wearing three-piece suits with chains for fob watches. They're very elegantly dressed gentlemen. And there's a man on one side holding a tied handkerchief, which he's about to drop for the match to begin.
Yes, well, because you're a visual artist, I knew, I don't know what page it's on, but the pictures in here are simply amazing, especially the men in the gray suits on the ship, and
that's right.
And we're sending them back, and or Borden's supposedly not sending them back. The Canada Immigration Office is sending them back.
That's right.
And so what did happen?
Well, the ship goes back. Finally, well, the two things happen. One is that Edward Byrd finally is given the right to meet his clients. For weeks, he's not allowed to meet the very people that he's representing. He's given a choice. Either you have a test case, so you choose one person that'll go before the British Columbia Court of Appeal in front of five judges. The government wants 5 judges rather than a singular judge because it feels that it can hedge its bets between 5 people.
Appeal court.
Appeal court. So, and the court is unanimous in its decision. The court basically says that Canada does have the right to discriminate on the basis of race in terms of the people it lets in. It's a remarkable judgment. And it really transforms Canadian immigration policy and legitimizes discrimination on the basis of race, and all the way until essentially 1968, when all references to country of origin and race are finally dropped from the Immigration Act. Now, when the ship goes, the passengers still don't want to go back because they've been starving and been driven to thirst. Finally, there's a truce that's negotiated. The government agrees to fuel and provision the ship. The ship turns back in the face of Canada's only battleship on the west coast, the HMCS Rainbow, pointing its guns at it, and the photographs are quite dramatic, that there's this battleship in front of an unarmed ship, pushing it back. There are 200 Canadian militia ready to storm the ship with bayonets attached to their guns if the passengers refuse. Finally, the passengers return. By the time they get back to India, the First World War has started.
Right. And are they safe in India?
No, they're not, because now the British Indian government considers themselves to be seditious. And given that many of them were British Indian Army veterans, and that 1 million Indian men are fighting in the war, the British are very afraid that this betrayal by one of its colonies is going to spread, through these men, is going to spread discontent and in the worst case scenario, a mutiny in the British Indian Army. They are met by an armed police force. There's an altercation that breaks out, and the police open fire on the men. Now, these men have been on ship for 6 months by now. Starving, driven to all kinds of desperation.
And perhaps planning a little something when they return.
They're furious. They're absolutely politicized and radicalized. There's no doubt about that. And so in that sense, the British fears are somewhat justified.
And the real lesson today in all of this.
Yes. Well, the real lesson in all of this, first thing, I think it's really important to recognize that the Komagata Maru was not incidental to Canadian immigration policy for the first 100 years. For the first 100 years, we had an immigration policy that was essentially a whites-only immigration policy. And that's why I use the title. I think it's a really important lesson to recognize that and be comfortable with it. Look, let's just get beyond that.
Sure.
Let's just name it. And once we name it, we can have a conversation about it.
Well, in some of the written papers,
Yes.
it suggests African Americans.
Yeah,
I don't think so.
That's right.
Because the climate isn't good for them.
That's right.
They'll never adjust.
That's right.
So no African American, no. Remember the Yellow Peril?
That's right. That's right. Which predates the Yellow Peril, predates the Hindu invasion. So I think one of the important lessons is that today, when we discuss this still very fraught issue of immigration, that I think we must name what happened fully in the past, not just say that there were dark chapters in our history, but there is this totality that amongst which there are these moments, but they're part of a continuum, they're part of this continuous journey. The second thing is, I think it's very important to recognize that while Canadians may have forgotten the Komagata Maru, the system hasn't, really. So what happened, the way the system dealt with the Komagata Maru still continues to happen today. For example, if you look at what happened with the last ship of Tamil refugees that came, the MV Sansi, their lawyers were, they were deemed to be in Canada, but not really landed in Canada, right? So they were held in CFB Esquimalt, but they haven't really crossed the border of Canada, so they haven't been processed. They were denied access to legal counsel for a very long time, just as the passengers were denied access to Edward Byrd. They were denied access to the media, which is the same thing that happened to the Komagata Maru. They couldn't speak to the media and get their voices heard to the Canadian
But they
public.
were veterans of the British Army.
And they were veterans of the British Army.
Yes, and that makes a little bit of difference.
That makes a big difference.
Somehow. But the press coverage of the day, you learned so much from what
right.
was really going on in the attitude. And, you know, my grandmother would say, well, dear, it was just the times.
It was just the times.
That's how it was. Her friend would say, well, you know, dear, the Chinese do laundry. I said, really? Grandma, that's racist. She said, oh, she's not a racist.
Absolutely.
I know.
It
was the
way.
times.
It was the times.
It was the times.
It was the world order at the time.
Well, thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me.
How nice to meet you.
Pleasure to meet you too.
Thank you. Undesirables, White Canada and the Komagata Maru, Ali Kazimi.